a time when global power equations are continuously shifting with unprecedented speed, India is leveraging geoeconomic disruptions into a strategic advantage. Fueled by resilient growth and a robust demographic dividend, India is actively shaping the narrative of global economic engagement. These points were brought in focus in the recently concluded 11th edition of the Times Network India Economic Conclave held in New Delhi. This year, the theme of IDFC First Bank Presents India Economic Conclave was Navigating Geoeconomics, in line with the current flux in the world order. Up next in this episode is a conversation with Gita Gopinath, Professor of Economics, Harvard University and former Deputy MD IMF. She shares insights on the India-US tariff war, the changing geopolitical landscape, the important role of AI and the impact of air pollution on economic growth.
Tariff and trade is being weaponized, as we have seen. And you know, the global economy is witnessing fragmentation, be it tariff wars, supply chain realignments, and even geopolitical tensions. Do you think that this is a structural shift? This phase is here to stay, or eventually it will fade out?
Thank you, Meher, for having me speak at this conclave. You really picked probably the biggest issue of the day, which is geoeconomics. To your question of, are we in a structurally changed world, the answer is yes. So we have decisively moved away from the last, I would say, 50, 60 years of global economic integration that relied on countries bringing down tariffs, global trade growing substantially, especially in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Moved away from that. We are now in an environment where countries are not just thinking about economic efficiency, but they're also thinking about national security and also how to build resilience in their global supply chains. And I don't think we are going back from where we are now. But that said, in a sense, 2025 was a year when both everything changed, with the US raising tariffs to levels that we haven't seen in 100 years. But at the same time, it looks like nothing changed if you look at global growth. Let me just take the case of India. So if you look at the IMF's projection for growth for India in 2024, that was last year, this was October 2024, they were projecting what growth was going to be in 2025 for India. This is before the elections in the US and everything. The growth was projected to be 6.5% for India this year. This October, the IMF revised up India's growth for 2025 to 6.6%, but that came in before the second quarter growth numbers came out. So I expect they will move up to 7% the next time they come up with their numbers. So India is actually doing better than was predicted before the crisis. There are important reasons for that. I think the world has shown a lot of resilience. Different parts of the world for different reasons. I believe artificial intelligence has been a big offset for tariffs around the world. The spending on it has supported growth everywhere. So I don't think the lesson to take away is that high levels of tariffs are not a problem for the world. They are consequential. And I would say that the next couple of years, we will continue to see some of the drag from this geoeconomic environment that we're in.
Right. Before I move on to my next question, are you saying, because you mentioned about the GDP growth in last quarter and the quarter before that, considering that, is there a case for upward revision as an economist for you to revise India's growth forecast upwards?
Depending on where you're starting. So yes, I would say that the IMF's number was 6.6%. That's what they came out in October. But their forecast for the second quarter fiscal in terms of what the growth would be was much lower than what it turned out at over 8%. Just doing the math, I would expect that they would go up closer to 7%.
As you can see, the theme itself for this year's India Economic Conclave is Navigating Geoeconomics. In your view, how India should navigate this tariff situation? Because while the trade friction remains where it is, India and US remain strategic allies, and especially in the Indo-Pacific region. And if you look at Mr. Trump's social media posts lately, again, he's coming back to this whole keeping India at the center stage of Indo-Pacific and, the strategic view that US has. How India should navigate this tariff situation with US?
I mean, there's no ifs and buts. I mean, the US is a very important partner for India. And therefore, I think it is very important that both countries, both India and the US, work together to come up with a mutually agreeable solution for where they are. I think that's the pragmatic way forward. And I know that there are a lot of discussions happening in the background, and there's always the right time, and things can move very quickly. So that's the only way to move forward. I think it is to continue to build that partnership. On the other hand, India is also going about and building other trade partnerships. I mean, they have the new agreement with the UK, but also working with the European Union. I think this is something that India can continue to push on, because we are in a world where everybody's looking around for new partners. And India is in a position of strength to be able to be that partner for many more countries in the world.
Right. The finance minister, during her speech, did hint about safeguarding, domestic industry and retaining strategic economy, autonomy, fuel policy autonomy. Now that is actually in direct contrast with what maybe US wants as a part of the Indo-US trade deal. How do you see that playing out?
I think at this moment, probably for India, this is an easy decision, frankly, because the price of oil is now, I mean, it looks at just very recently, it went below $60 a barrel. At that price, well, in a sense, it's not a big trade-off between the economic security and the national security aspect. So there's going to be a lot of cheap enough oil in the market. I think India can decide where it wants to buy its oil from. But, there was a time a few years ago when Russia invaded Ukraine and oil prices shot up dramatically. And at that time, actually, the US encouraged India to continue buying oil from Russia because they didn't want the whole world to be moving away from Russia, because that would raise prices everywhere. We're not in that situation now, and oil prices are down to $60 a barrel. I think it's a good time to figure out, maybe there are other countries to buy from.
So are you saying that Mr. Trump's tough stance as far as Indian oil purchase from Russia is concerned is directly linked to oil prices? As they soften, Mr. Trump's stance hardens. Is that how it's playing out?
I don't think so. I'm basing this entirely from an economist's perspective. I'm just saying that, in a sense, the trade-off is really not that big for India, given where oil prices are globally.
Right. You did mention about probable or maybe a possibility of further trade war escalation with China from US. If that happens, and as we already know, the global supply chains are diversifying, and there is a clear conscious effort to move away from having over-dependence on any one single geography or country. Now, how well positioned is India to capture this opportunity compared to, let's say, peers like Vietnam or Mexico, and there are a host of other countries who are trying to be part of the diversification in supply chain?
Yeah, just to be clear, I don't think that the US is necessarily going to escalate their tariffs on China. The US depends on China for rare earths, and that is becoming a big, important deterrent. I was talking more about other countries, like in Europe, where this could be a factor. What India needs to do in terms of tapping into the global supply chain is continuing on the path of all the big reforms that it needs for its own internal growth, right? And as was mentioned by several people, including the finance minister, the improvement that we've seen in physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure in India is super helpful, and that should continue. But that needs to be then complemented with other ongoing reforms. I think one big hurdle for India to be a big industrial power is land acquisition. That remains very complicated. Land titling is not clean. It's very hard to acquire land in India. That is an important constraint on how fast you can build out. And that is, I believe, an important constraint on growth. Now, there are states that are actually doing innovative things. Like Andhra Pradesh, I think, has some very innovative policies in being able to hasten land acquisition, and policies of those kind can be helpful everywhere else. So I think that's one area where this is required. Second, of course, is deregulation. India remains to be it's still a tough place to do business. I mean, there has been improvement, things have gotten better, but there is still a lot of regulation, a lot of bureaucracy. Corruption is still an issue, a big issue. And so addressing all of that is going to be critical if India has to become a major player on the global stage in global supply chains.
Gita, I've been reading lately what you've been writing on AI, and obviously everybody in India is very curious about AI. While it's expected to transform, productivity, it's definitely going to also disrupt labor markets, especially in Indian perspective. How India should prepare for the AI revolution, keeping in mind the job scenario, keeping in mind the required growth scenario, and keeping in mind the population.
I think this is going to be a very important challenge for India for the reason that I also said earlier, which is if you look at the contribution of labor to growth in India, it's only been about 30%. So you need to find new ways to have productive jobs. If India goes from capital-intensive manufacturing to capital-intensive services, then I don't know where the jobs will come from. So that is a tricky one. In terms of the numbers, the estimate is about 26% of India's workforce is exposed to AI. The average for the world is about 40%. So 40% for the world on average, 26% for India. 26% because if you look at where most of India's labor is, 40% of India's labor is still in agriculture. So it's not that exposed to AI. But it's 26%. Exposure doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's about 50-50. About half of that will benefit from AI. The other half will suffer from AI. There are also estimates that have been made about what the potential impact on productivity growth could be of India AI adoption, and it ranges from like 0.3%, 3%. So it's a pretty big range, but it can be very substantial too. What will it take? I think in the case of India, digital public infrastructure, the more build out, that's going to be absolutely critical, and then human capital, skilling. I mean, having the ability to actually use this technology. Also in the case of India, the fact that there are shortages of certain kinds of skills, like in healthcare, it helps. AI will be very helpful in expanding the access to healthcare. Similarly, in terms of education, to raise the quality of education, you could, again, use AI to be able to improve the, close some of the skill gaps that exist. But this is not going to happen automatically. I think it's going to require actually a pretty thought-through strategy.
There is a sense of disillusionment in India about how Mr. Trump is warming up to Pakistan. Do you think it's a passing phase or it's there to stay? Because he has been bringing in everything, investing in Pakistan, the energy security, rare earth and whatnot.
Yeah, no, I think I would not claim to be an expert on President Trump's, feelings or views about individual countries. I do think that that's something that probably can change over time too.
But do you also fear his morning tweets, Mr. Trump's?
I think, we've gotten used to it.
Okay, yeah, because Howard was at the receiving end for a very long time. But, okay, that brings me to the H-1B issue. And that's a very critical one and very sensitive for India. What is your view on this whole H-1B policy and the way Mr. Trump has been going after the quota that India receives from H-1B quota internationally? What is your view on that?
So, just firstly, we should put things in perspective. H-1B visas as a share of the US labor force is tiny. These are very small numbers. Now, it's just that 70% of those visas go to Indians. And so that's why the Indians are particularly conscious of what is happening over there. President Trump actually, compared to several of the other people in his party, does believe that the US needs talent from other parts of the world, right? So there is, in fact, a push to simply end the H-1B visa program. And Trump has said, no, we need it because we need to get highly skilled people from all the parts of the world. But we're just going to put the bar higher, so we're going to require a $100,000 fee to make that happen. I think what we all have to get used to, and I think this is another structural shift going forward, is that the world is not going to be as an attractive place for immigrants, just more generally. And by world, I mean it's not just the US, I think it's true in Europe, it's true in Canada, it's true everywhere. The UK, there has been an important sentiment shift everywhere in the major economies, where the attractiveness of immigrants and what they bring to society, I think, is raising a lot of issues. And so we may be past peak immigration too in the world. I do think this is, again, not just a US phenomenon. I think it's very broadly true. This is one common factor you see across almost all countries, is this pushback against immigration.
I'll now move on to climate. That's the other major issue after AI. And the climate change is creating a lot of challenges, and obviously there is an increased economic and financial risk. But for a country like India, which needs a lot of energy, which is far behind in per capita energy consumption compared to, let's say, China or US, how do we balance between our ambition of being a developed nation by 2047 and still remain climate conscious, and then go ahead and meet being carbon neutral, ambition by 2075? It's a very tricky balancing act.
Yeah. I actually don't see this as a big trade-off for India. So let me tell you, we're all sitting here. The air quality outside is hazardous by any metric that you look at. So if you look at the impact of what that is doing to the Indian economy in terms of the effect on health. So this is a very nice study that was done that looked for a particular year, it was 2019, looked at the effect of air pollution only, air pollution on premature deaths in India. That number is 1.67 million deaths. That's 18%. 18% of the deaths that happened in 2019 were attributable to air pollution. That is every year, and it's gotten worse since 2019. So, and then if you look at the effect of this on just morbidity, right? Health, lung cancer, heart disease, and so on. And you look at the economic cost. In terms of today's dollars, that's about, for the Indian economy, on an annual basis, about $60 billion. To put that in perspective, the tariffs that India is facing from the US, the effect on the Indian economy is about 1/4 of that, right? And it's going to go away. It's going to go away in a couple of years. But this is not going away. So whatever India needs to do to have cleaner air, it goes along with having renewables, which of course a lot of progress has been made on that front. But if this air quality situation is not addressed frankly on a war footing, it's a big knock to India's growth.
Right. Okay. So let me put it this way. Because we have an ambitious goal that Mr. Prime Minister has set up for India, that India will be a developed nation by 2047. If you had to flag, one risk and one major opportunity for India in the new geoeconomic era, what those would be?
I think that the risk and the opportunity are the same thing here. The opportunity is for India to continue on the path of steadfast structural reforms, to then be able to deliver higher standards of living for all Indians, better air, better health. All of that will be important. The risk is if that stalls. The risk is, and that is not something that has not happened in the past, it's very common for countries to end up basically, you don't have any more reforms, there's reform fatigue sets in. If that happens, then that's a lost opportunity.
So, in a world which is sort of marked by fragmentation and uncertainty, do you think India has a unique opportunity not just to grow faster, but to even shape the rules of the global economic order?
Again, as Vaidya also made this point, which is that as India grows in terms of growing at 8%, the macro stability that it demonstrates, all of that gives it a very important seat at the table. And as we know, it's only a matter of time, maybe 2 or 3 years, before India is the third largest economy in the world. So nobody ignores India. It's absolutely critical to the global order. India plays a very important role on the global stage. I think it did a phenomenal job when it had the G20 presidency. It did really a very big job in terms of addressing global debt issues, but also the topic of crypto and how to regulate crypto, which continues to be an issue to this day. So India has been able to leave an important stamp. It has strong leadership, it has strong diplomacy, using both of that to continue the conversation, to bring together other emerging and developing countries, to put their needs out there. I think India should play an important role.
Right. Since you mentioned crypto, what's your view on crypto and how that part is going to play out going forward for all economies, not only India?
Yeah. So obviously the crypto space is evolving over time. You have the Bitcoins of the world, and they go up and down in terms of value. The new kid on the block are stable coins, which are basically cryptocurrencies that have stable values. The dollar stable coin is the overwhelming stable coin of what we have here in terms of the stable coin market cap is about 300 million. The vast majority is in dollar stable coins. In this particular case, unlike Bitcoin, where I worried less about loss of monetary sovereignty and other things, I worry more about that when it comes to stable coins, because stable coins come closest to what seems like money, though they're not exactly money. They come very close to it. And if you look at the data, and you have to do a fair bit of forensics to understand this, because it's not easy to just simply know where the money is going, most of the holding of stable coins in dollars as a share of the country's GDP is basically in countries with high inflation. It's in Latin America where you have the holding of stable coins as a share of their GDP, right? So I do think all countries, and this is going to be true for India too, should have should think of how they will address concerns about capital control evasion, of capital flows that evade the rules and the laws of the country in this environment, in this case of stable coins. So I think this is required.